Wow. All right, man, let's do it. White slavery. White slavery, also white slave trade or white slave trafficking, refers to the chattel slavery of Europeans, whether by non Europeans such as West Asians and North Africans, or by other Europeans, for example, naval galley slaves or the Vikings, thralls. Slaves of European origin were present in ancient Rome and the Ottoman Empire. Many different types of white people were enslaved on the European continent under feudalism, right? Under feudalism. There were various forms of status applying to people, such as serf, border, villein, vagabond, and slave, who were indentured or forced to labor without pay. Under Muslim rule, the Arab trades that included Caucasian captives were often fueled by raids into European territories or were taken as children in the form of blood tax from the families of citizens of conquered territories to serve the empire for a variety of functions. In the mid 19th century, the term white slavery was used to describe Christian slaves who were sold into barbarian slave trade. Sold into the barbarian slave trade. The modern legal term applies more narrowly to sexual slavery, forced prostitution, and human trafficking, with less focus on the race of victims or perpetrators. Right? It's the modern legal term, right, applies to more narrowly. Now it's a broader aspect of it. Okay. History. The phrase white slavery was used by Charles Sumner in 1847 to describe the chattel slavery of Christians throughout the barbarian states and in primarily in Algiers. Okay, the capital of the Ottoman Algeria. It also encompassed many forms of slavery, including the European concubines, carrying, often found in Turkish harems. All right, that sounds like carry. So the carries of the world, they're talking about the concubines, the European concubines, white European concubines. The term was also used by Clifford G. Rowe from the beginning of the 20th century to the campaign against the forced prostitution and sexual slavery of girls who worked in Chicago brothels. Similarly, countries of Europe signed in Paris in 1904 an international agreement for the suppression of white slave traffic aimed at combating the sale of women who were forced into prostitution in the countries of continental Europe. Understand that now. 1904, continental Europe, continental United States. All right, Slavic slaves, white slaves, Slavics, slaves. The word slave comes from the word Slav. All right. The Volga trade route was established by Varangians or Vikings who settled in northwestern Russia, okay, Russia, in the early 9th century. And about 10 kilometers, 6 miles south of Volkhov River, entry into Lake Ladoga, sound like Dogon tribe. They established a settlement called Ladoga, Old Norse, Adiajabrod, and it connected northern Europe and northwestern Europe with the Caspian Sea via the Volga River. The Rus used this route uh, to trade with the Muslim countries on the southern shores of the Caspian Sea, sometimes penetrating as far as the Baghdad. The route functioned concurrently with the Dnieper route, better known as the trade route from the Varangians to Greeks, and lost its importance in the 11th century. Saquilaba originally was used to denote Slavic people. Key, Saquilaba, Slavic people. However, later it became to denote all European slaves in some Muslim regions, like Spain, including those abducted from raids on Christian kingdoms of Spain. Okay. The Franks started buying slaves from the Slavs. So the Slavs were selling themselves. And Avar Kanganate while Muslims also came across slaves in the form of mercenaries serving the Byzantine Empire and settlers, in addition to among the Khazars. Okay, so the Khazars, Slavics, slaves, white slaves. Most Slavic slaves were imported to the Muslim world through the border between Christian and Islamic kingdoms, where castration centuries were also located instead of the direct route. From there, they were sent into Islamic Spain and other Muslim ruled regions, especially North Africa. The Sakoliba gained popularity in Umayyad Spain, especially as warriors. Often, the collapse of the Umayyads. They also came to rule over many of the Taifas. With the conversion of the Eastern Europe, the trade declined, and there isn't much textual information on Sequilaba after the 11th century. Right. Sequila, the Slavic people, slaves, a lot of them was missionaries and stuff like that too. So they were shipped to different places, being able to do different things, coming to be different people, but under servitude for different purposes. Central Europe was the most favored destination for importation of slaves along Central Asia and Bilad at Sudan, right? So Central Europe was the most favored destination, okay? That's like the Algiers. They say those slaves from Northwestern Europe were also valued, right? Those slaves, they say though slaves from Northwestern Europe were also valued, okay? This slave trade was controlled mostly by European slave traders. France and Venice were the routes used to send Slavic slaves to Muslim lands, and Prop served as the major century for castration of Slavic captives. The Emirate of Barbary also served as an important port for this trade. Due to the Byzantine Empire and Venice blocking Arab merchants from European ports, they later started importing slaves from the Caucasus and Caspian Sea. The Sequaliba were also imported as eunuchs and concubines to Muslim states. The slavery of eunuchs in the Muslim world, however, was expensive, and they thus were given as gifts by rulers. The Sequaliba eunuchs were prominent at the court of Alibids or something like that, Alibids, and later Fatimids, who imported them from Spain. The Fatimids also used other Sequaliba slaves for military purposes, okay? Crimean Khanate. They say in the time of the Crimean Khanate, Crimeans engaged in frequent raids into the Danubian principalities, Poland, Lithuania, and Muscovy. For each captive, the Khan people received a fixed share, salvaga, of 10% or 20%, and commission, agent tax. You know what I mean? The campaigns by Crimean forces categorized into Cephers, declared military operations led by the Khans themselves and Kapurs, raids undertaken by groups of noblemen, right? Who was raiding? The noblemen were. Sometimes illegally because they contravened treaties concluded by Khans with neighboring rulers. For a long time, until the early 18th century, the Khanate maintained a massive slave trade with the Ottoman Empire and Middle East. Kaffa was one of the best known and significant trading ports and slave markets. Crimean Tatar raiders enslaved between 1 and 2 million slaves from Russia and Poland, Lithuania, over the period of 1500 to 1700, right? 1500, 1700. That's why the slaves coming from Russia and all them places. They say Kaffa city in Crimean Peninsula was one of the best known and significant trading ports and slave markets. In 1769, a last major Tatar raid resulted in capture of 20,000 Russian and Ruthenian slaves. Barbarian slave trade, right? Barbarian slave trade. Slave markets flourished on the Barbarian coast of North Africa in what is not modern day Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Western Libya, not Eastern Libya, right? Between the 15th and middle of the 19th century. These markets prospered while the states were nominally under Ottoman suzerainty, though in reality they were mostly autonomous. The North African slave markets traded in European slaves, which were acquired by Barbary pirates and slave raids on ships and by raids on coastal towns from Italy to Spain, Portugal, France, England, and the Netherlands, right? Or say the Netherlands, my bad, say the Netherlands, and as far as the Turkish abductions in Iceland. Okay, so it's Netherlands and Iceland. Men, women, and children were captured, such as the such a It say men, women, and children were captured to such a devastating extent that vast numbers of seacoast towns were abandoned. Okay, vast numbers of coast towns were abandoned because they knew these folks coming, so they went inward. That sounds like the United States. I think that's how they got their foothold on a lot of the United States. Why a lot of the coastal United States had all these European streets names and all that type of stuff. Yeah, I think that's why, especially from where I'm from. All right, according to Robert Davis, between 1 million and 1.25 million Europeans were captured by barbarian pirates and sold as slaves in North Africa and Ottoman Empire between the 15th and 19th centuries. However, due to extrapolate his numbers, Davis assumes the number of European slaves captured by barbarian pirates was constant for a 250-year period, right? Stated. That's 250 years, that's a long time. There are no records of how many men, women, and children were enslaved, but it is possible to calculate roughly the number of fresh captives that would have been needed to keep population steady and replace those slaves who died, escaped, were ransomed, or converted to Islam. On this basis, it is thought that around 8,500 new slaves were needed annually to replenish numbers. About 850,000 captives over the century from 1580 to 1680, right? By extension, for the 250 year between 1530 and 1780, the figure could easily have been as high as 1,250,000. All right, Davis's numbers have been challenged by other historians, such as David Early, who cautions that the true picture of European slaves is clouded by the fact the corsairs also seized non-European whites from Eastern Europe, and black people from West Africa. Right, trying to slide the black people on in there and all that. The black people want enslaving them. Then you might be right for here and there, but no, these like no man. Listen, what y'all see talking about though? The main idea though, they were slaves. Okay, all right. So talk about the book and all that stuff. It say it is worth noting the fluctuation. Yeah, okay, that's all the opinionated shit. So we get to the nitty gritty of the shit. We know for sure. My bad for the profanity. We already know for sure they was enslaved, though. That's the main idea we trying to see. It says such observations across the late 1500s, early 1600s, 1600 observers, right, account for around 35,000 European Christian slaves held throughout this period on the Barbarian coast across Tripoli and Tunis, but mostly Idris. The majority were sailors, particularly those who were English, taken from with their ships, but others were fishermen and coastal villagers. However, most of these captives were people from lands close to Africa, particularly Spain and Italy. Okay, so now we talk about the Afrikaans. That's what we talk about, the white folk, the Dutch descent, all that stuff, Netherlands. Okay, listen. They say their bases on the Barbarian coast of North Africa. The Barbarian pirates raided ships traveling through uh, my bad. I had my phone rang up. I don't know where that. But anyway, it's Africa, particularly Spain and Italy. It's I lost my place, y'all. My fault. It's from bases on the Barbarian coast of North Africa, the Barbarian pirates raided ships through the Mediterranean, later along the northern and western coast of Africa. It said plundering their cargo and enslaving the people they captured. All right. From at least 1500, the pirates also conducted raids along seaside towns of Italy, Spain, France, England, the Netherlands, and as far as West Iceland, capturing men, women, and children. On some occasions, settlements such as Baltimore, Ireland, were abandoned following the raid, only to be resettled many years later between 1609 and 1616. England alone had 466 merchant ships lost to barbarian pirates, while barbarian consorts looted to the Congo my bad, say while barbarian consorts looted to the cargo of ships they captured. Their primary goal was to capture people for sale as slaves as for ransom. Those who had family or friends who might ransom them were held captive, but not obliged to work. The most famous of these were Arthur Miguel de Cervantes, who were held for almost 5 years. Others were sold into various types of servitude. Attractive women and boys were used as sex slaves. Captives who converted to Muslim, it said captives who were converted to Islam were generally freed, since enslaving of Muslims was prohibited. But this meant that they could never return to their native countries. Moroccan Sultan Moulay Ismail bin Sharif controlled a fleet of consorts based on Saleh Viax and Saleh de Nif, Saleh Nif or whatever, all right, now Rabat, which supplied him with Christian slaves and weapons through their raids in the Mediterranean all the way back to the Black Sea. Mullah Ismail was nicknamed the Bloody King by Europeans due to extreme cruelty and exaction of summary justice upon the Christian slaves. He is also known in his native country as the Warrior King. 16th, 18th century customs and statistics suggest that the Istanbul's additional slave import from the Black Sea may have totaled around 2.5 million from 1450 to 1700. The markets declined after the loss of barbarian wars and ended in 1830s when the region was conquered by France. All right, so what ended it is 1830s wars conquering in France. All right, Christian slavery in Muslim Iberia. All right, during the Al-Adonis, also known as Islamic Iberia, the Moors controlled much of the peninsula. Muslim Spain imported Christian slaves from the 18th century until the Conquista. Okay, so Muslim Spain imported Christian slaves from the 8th century until the Reconquista. In the 15th century, the slaves were imported from the Christian region of Spain, as well as from Eastern Europe, sparking significant reaction from many in Christian Spain and many Christians still living in Muslim Spain. Soon after, Muslims were successful, taking 30,000 Christian captives from Spain and from Spain in the 8th century. Slavery lasted longer due to the frequent cross-border skirmishes interspersed between periods of major campaigns. By the 10th century, in the Eastern Mediterranean, Byzantine Christians were captured by Muslims. Many of the raids designed by Muslims were created for a fast capture of prisoners. Therefore, Muslims restricted the control in order to keep captives from fleeing. Okay, the Iberian Peninsula served as a base for further exports of slaves into other Muslim regions in North Africa. Ottoman slave trade. Slavery was a legal and significant part of the Ottoman Empire's economy and societies. The main sources of slaves were war captives and organized enslavement expeditions in Africa, Eastern Europe, and Circassia and Georgia in the Caucasus. It has been reported that the selling price of slaves fell after large military operations. Enslavement of Europeans were banned in the early 19th century, right, 1800s, when enslavement of other groups were permitted. Okay, enslavement of other groups were permitted. So that's why they started being labeled as Africans and all that type of stuff. Really, they were still slaves on the cool, but they just started relabeling them. But y'all see, that's where they start getting their little protection on and the shift of power started to happen because other people were still allowed to be slaves, right? They say early after Early after several measures to ban slavery in the 19th century, the practice continued largely unabated into the early 20th century, right? So still going on since 1900. As late as 1908, female slaves were still sold in the Ottoman Empire. Sexual slavery was a central part of Ottoman slave system throughout the history of its institution, right? Just they're still going down, right? Spanish slaves. So we're talking about Juneteenth and all that type of stuff. Okay, this in the Araku War, 1550-1662, a long-running conflict between Spanish and Macapuches in Chile, right, South America. Both sides engaged in slavery of the enemy population, among other atrocities. Much like the Spanish had captured Mapuche people, the Mapuches had also captured Spaniards, often women, and traded their ownership among them. Indeed, with the destruction of the seven cities, 1599, 1604, Mapuches are reported to have taken 500 Spanish women captive, holding them as slaves. It was not uncommon for captive women. It was not uncommon for captive Spanish women to have changed owner several times. As late as the 1850s, alleged shipwreck survivor Elisa Bravo was said to be living as a wife of Mapuche cacique in what is described as the most brutal forced coexistence, resulting in children of mixed blood. A report dating from 1863 said that her captors, fearing vengeance from Spaniards, sold her to the warlord Kafukura in Pua Mapu for 100 martyrs, but that she had died after 3 years. All right, European slavery in Rome, in ancient Rome. So you already see how they connected everybody around the world. It say in the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, slaves counted for most of the means of industrial output in Roman commerce. Right? They had slaves around, and most of them, they accounted for most of the work. It says slaves were drawn from all over Europe and the Mediterranean, including Gaul, Hispania, South America, North Africa, Syria, Germania, Britannia, and Balkans, and Greece. Generally, slaves in Italy were indigenous Italians, maybe some of the Etruscans and all of them, with a minority of foreigners, including both slaves and freedmen. Right? Freedmen. Okay, way over there in Europe, they're talking freedmen talk. It's a born outside of Italy, estimated 5% of the total in the capital, where their number was largest at its peak. Slaves numbering in the tens of thousands were compelling to work in the mines or quarries, where conditions were notoriously brutal. It's a Damnati and Metal Muller, those condemned in the mine, were convicts who lost their freedom as citizens, libertas, forfeited their property, bona, to the state, right? And became servi, ponoin, slaves as a legal penalty. Their status under the law was different from that of other slaves. They could not buy their freedom, be sold, or be set free. They were expected to live and die in the mines. Imperial slaves and freedmen, the familia Caesarius, worked in mine administration and management. In the late Republic, about half the gladiators who fought in Roman arenas were slaves. Though the most skilled were often free volunteers. Okay, free volunteer slaves, the gladiators, right? In the Roman Empire. All right, successful gladiators were occasionally rewarded with freedom. However, gladiators, being trained warriors and having access to weapons, were potentially the most dangerous slaves. At an earlier time, many gladiators had been soldiers taken captive in war. Spartacus, who led a slave rebellion of 73 to 71 BC, was a rebel gladiator. The slaves imported in Italy were native Europeans, and very few of them from outside of Europe. This has been confirmed by biochemical analysis of 166 skeletons from three imperial era cemeteries in the vicinity of Rome, where the bulk of the slaves lived, which shows that only one individual came from outside of Europe, North Africa, and right? It say, hold on. You see how they use Europe and North Africa synonymously, right? And another two possibly did, but results are unconclusive. In the rest of the Italian peninsula, the fraction of non-European slaves was much lower than that. All right, slavery under Islamic rule. The pension or pinyat tax, meaning the 1/5, was a taxation based on the verse of the Quran, whereby 1/5 of spoils of war belonged to God, to Muhammad, and to his family, to orphans, to those in need, and to travelers. Okay, the gypsies and all that, man. This eventually included slaves and war captives. This eventually included slaves and war captives were given to soldiers and officers to motivate their participation in wars. Okay. Christians and Jews, known as people of the book in Islam, were considered dhimmis in territories where Muslim ruled, a status of second-class citizens that were afforded limited freedoms, legal protections, personal safety, and were allowed to practice their religion, subject to certain conditions, and to enjoy a measure of communal autonomy in return to paying the jizya and kharaj taxes. If the dhimmi broke his agreement and left Muslim territory for enemy land, he was liable to be enslaved, unless the dhimmi had left Muslim territory because he suffered injustice there. Dhimmis were protected persons who could not be enslaved unless they violated the terms of protection. Such violations normally included rebellion or treason. According to some authorities, this could also include failure to pay due taxes. Failure to pay tax could also result in imprisonment. Man, it sounds like the American government. You know what I mean? How they doing these celebrities and stuff too. The government officials and all that. Okay. The diversionary, what they call it, was a blood tax largely imposed in the Balkans and Anatolia, in which the Ottoman Empire sent military to collect Christian boys between the ages of 8 to 18 who were taken from their families and raised to serve the empire. You understand that now? They were taking these boys. Okay. The tax was imposed by Murad I in the middle 1300s, and lasted until the reign of Ahmed III in the early 1700s. From the mid to late 14th through early 18th centuries, the dissurgme janissary, sound like Janus system, enslaved an estimated 500,000 to 1 million non-Muslim adolescent males. These boys would attain a great education and high social standing after their training and forced conversion to Islam. Basilic Popolia wrote that the diversionary was the forcible removal in the form of a tribute of children of the Christian subjects from their ethnic, religious, and cultural environment and their transportation into the Turkish Islamic environment with the aim of employing them in the service of the palace, the army, and the state, whereby they were, on the one hand, to serve the Sultan as slaves and freedmen, right? And on the other hand, to form the ruling class of the state. You understand that? It said the army and the state, right? Come on now. It said indentured servitude. In the 17th to 18th century, many white people in Britain, Ireland, and European colonies in North America were indentured servants. Sterling professor of history of Yale, of history at Yale, David Byron Davis wrote that from Barbados to Virginia, colonists long before English or Irish indentured servants as their main. Listen, let me read that again. My bad. It say from Barbados to Virginia, colonists long preferred English or Irish indentured servants as their main source of field labor. During most of the 17th century, they showed few scruples about reducing their fortunate countrymen to a status a little different from chattel slaves. All right, there was a little different, just slightly above chattel slavery. It's a degradation, right? A degradation that was being carried out in a more extreme and far more extensive way with respect to the peasantry in the contemporary Russia. The prevalence and suffering of white slaves, serfs, and indentured servants in the early modern period suggests that there was nothing inevitable about limiting plantation slavery to people of African origin. Okay. So they try to show African origin in that way. We know what they're talking about. North Africa's people, white folks, Slavics, listen, Netherlands, Germany. Okay, listen. Between 50 and 67% of white immigrants to the American colonies from the 1630s and the American Revolution had traveled under indenture. Many women brought to the colonies were poor, some were abandoned or young girls out of wedlock, others prostitutes or criminals. So we got all this religious stuff for the Slavic people. One ship's captain reportedly described them as the Villianes, right? A ship captain described them as the villainous and demoralized lot. Okay, many were transported against their will and for profit to Virginia and Maryland. The French transported women from Salpêtrière prison for the homeless, insane, and criminal to New Orleans. All right, send them to New Orleans. They say women held at Salpêtrière were bound in chains, flogged, and lived in generally poor and unsanitary conditions. Female inmates, some of whom were sick with venereal disease, were forced to attend confessions 3 times each day, where they would be whipped if their demeanor and behaviors were not acceptably penitent. In addition to Salpêtrière, the French transported women from other almshouses and hospitals, including Bicêtre, Hospital General de Paris, and Pita. All right. So that's how I put it in. All right, white slave traffic. It's a main article, International Agreement of Suppression of the White Slave Traffic. See also historical history of sexual slavery in the United States and white slavery, okay? It's an international agreement for the suppression of white slave traffic is a series of anti-human trafficking treaties. The first of which was first negotiated in Paris in 1904, was one of the first multilateral treaties to address issues of slavery and human trafficking. The slavery, servitude, forced labor, and similar institutions and practices conventions of 1926 and the International Convention of the Suppression of the Trafficking Women my bad, let's slow down right now. It's the International Convention for the Suppression of Trafficking in Women of Full Age of 1933 are similar documents, right? Women of full age. What? So what about the women of young age? Okay. It's a White Slave Traffic Act of 1910. In 1910, the U.S. Congress passed the White Slave Traffic Act, better known as the Mann Act, right? 1910, U.S. Congress passed the White Slave Traffic Act, right? Better known as the Mann Act. See, that's how they switched it up. Mann Act. What? No. They should have that White Slave Traffic, so everybody know what that is. They said which made it a felony to transport women across state borders for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery, or for any other immoral purpose. The act was applied to the wide variety of offenses, many of which were consensual in nature. Listen now, they say most of them was consensual, and they hitting these boys under this White Slave Traffic Act, bro. You know what I'm saying? That was in 1910. You know what I mean? That's how they hitting these boys, the Bill Cosby and all them. And they say of which was consensual in nature didn't even matter. You see what I'm saying? When you got them just to have sex with them, just to have. Oh, wow. That's what's going on. I don't want to get. Well, look at here. Y'all caught that? Even in Peep Game now, back in the 1900s, 1910, stuff like that, these white boys were getting hung and stuff like that for dealing with these white girls. Stop them, hey, where y'all going? What you doing to the white girl? And all this type of stuff. And they get, yeah. I remember that now. It's a criminal law amendment white slave traffic bill. An attempt was made to introduce a similar law in the UK between 1910 and 1913. That's the Criminal Law Amendment Act 1912. Arthur Lee would state that the House of Commons, right, The United Kingdom, and particularly England, and is increasingly becoming a clearinghouse and deep. Let's not do what they say now. This is quote. It say the United Kingdom, and particularly England, is increasingly becoming a cleaning house and depot and dispatch century of the white slave traffic and the headquarters of the foreign agents engaged in the most expensive and lucrative phase of the business. It says South America was stated as the main destination for the trafficked girls. Understand that now? It said the spectacular commented, the spectator commented that the bill has been blocked by a member, alluding to uh, Frederick Handel Booth, or members who, for various reasons, consider it not a measure which ought to be placed upon the statute book, as it would affect the liberty of the individual. So they just looked this off the books. They just denied the bill. You know what I'm saying? They were like, "Nah, we need to let that stay where it's at." So I mean, it's still going on over there in UK too. Okay, you know, as far as like the trafficking to South America and all that stuff. But 1910 stuff, they let you know, hey, that's the Man Act. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah, y'all ever see what come up with the Man Act? Say the White Slave Trade Act, Traffic Act, right? Also called Man Act. It's United States federal law passed June 25th, 1910. Okay, man, let's see what it say. My bad. June 5th, 1910. It is named after Congressman James Robert Mann. No, they got the Manns that's out here doing their thing in the music and all that stuff. But anyway, that's a whole nother thing, you know. But yeah, I just want to tap into that right quick. You know what I mean? Build further off of it at some other time, whatever. But yeah, man, I'll get with y'all.